Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel on that we're calling Testing Aspects of Situational Action Theory, and based on the Malmö Individual and Neighborhood Development Study, MINDS. I'm very glad that so many of you came this morning, despite the early hour. Okay, I should speak in the microphone, obviously, and despite the rain. My name is Anna-Karin Ivert, and I'm the Deputy Director of this project. And the PI is Marie Torstensson-Levander, who's sitting here. I will start by giving a brief introduction to the project and then an overview of some basic findings in relation to crime involvement, propensity, and exposure. And then will my colleagues develop these different aspects further on in their presentations. So, MINDS is an ongoing longitudinal study of a random sample of adolescents who was born in 1995 and who are residing in the city of Malmö in the south of Sweden, for those of you who doesn't know, in the fall of 2007. And it is in total 225 adolescents who participated in this project at some point, and it's about 20% of the total cohort of adolescents born in 1995. And this project is modeled on the Peterborough Adolescent Young Adult Study that all of you are familiar with, I guess. And the questionnaires are exact copies of the ones used in the PED study. But in some cases, we have adjusted this to Swedish conditions to make it more comprehensive. And we also added questions about victimization and perceived mental health from the start of the project, which is measures that came into the PED study later on, or, yeah. And in 2007 to 2009, the project was planned and organized, and the staff was trained by, or some of us was trained by staff from the PEDS group. And this is an overview of our data collection. Up to now, we have interviewed data from a subsample of parents, and we have collected data from the children at 4 points. And the first point was just a small a smaller sample of children, and at the 3 last data collections, we had the total cohort. And the data collected within the project comprises information from questionnaires and from space-time budgets, and it covers areas such as the individual and her social and individual characteristics, experience and behaviors, as well as information about the different environments where the adolescents spend their time. In the presentations you will hear today, we will use data from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th wave of data collection. It might be a bit confusing because we are at some points in calling them different things. In my presentation, they will be named time 2, 3, and 4, and in some of the others will be time 1 and 2. But it's these 3 time points that we are using when they are from the last year of compulsory school to the last year of upper secondary school. It covers from about age 15, 16 to age 18, 19. So, this first part focuses on some of the basic things like crime involvement, propensity, and exposure. And I will give you, as I said, very basic findings over the 3 years, and looking at how boys and girls differ in crime involvement, crime propensity, and exposure. So, if we start by looking at crime involvement, it's a measure that is based on 9 items of different types of offenses that we are asking if the adolescent committed last year. And it's like shoplifting, theft from a person, assault, robbery, residential burglary, non-residential burglary, theft of a car, vandalism, and arson. And over the years, the types of crimes that are most often committed varies a bit. The first time, when they are about 15, 16, the most common crime are shoplifting, and then at later time points, it's more vandalism and arson. And if we look at crime involvement first, you can see this classic age crime curve with an increase at age 16, 17, and then a decrease when they get older at age 18, 19. At the first time point, there are actually no difference between boys and girls in crime involvement, but after that, boys, their crime involvement increases much more than the girls. And then we have a significant difference in crime involvement between boys and girls for the rest of the project. And we can see that crime involvement, it changes significantly over time. But by looking at the stability coefficients, we can see that they are moderately stable over time. It's more stable for girls between time 2 and time 3, and then it levels off. And for boys, it's more similar between the different points. And this pattern is similar whether we're using a variety scale or frequency scale, or we are different types of measures of crime involvement. The next thing I will give you some results about is crime propensity. And as you all know, it's in the framework of SAT, it's moral values and ability to exercise self-control. And we have, for moral values, we have a sum of 16 different items, and for ability to exercise self-control, we have a sum of 8 different items. And then are then combined into a scale crime propensity. Moral values tend to decrease over time. So the adolescents tend to think their acceptance of breaking moral rules tend to be increase over time, which is not in line with previous findings. But self-control, on the other hand, remains stable over time. So we can see that crime propensity, it increases over time, and that is mainly, or totally, I would say, due to increases in, or decrease in morality, moral values. And girls consistently report higher moral values, or higher morality, than boys. And this is a bit confusing since a high value indicates low morality, but the point is that girls have better morality than boys, measured like this. We can also see that this changes significantly over time. And propensity appears to be quite stable from the first time that we measured until our last data collection. And if we look at exposure, in this presentation I used 2 questions from the questionnaire. Some of my colleagues will use data from the space-time budget instead to look at exposure, but I just take 2 examples here. And it's how many nights a week do you spend in the city center of Malmö, and how many days do you spend outdoor in streets, parks, playgrounds without doing anything particular that I will call unstructured activities. And if I correlate these measures with measures from the space-time budget, they are definitely correlated, so that children who are reporting that they spend a lot of time in the city center at nights in the space-time budgets also report this in a questionnaire. Okay, so we can see that there are actually not that big differences in time spent in city center at night between boys and girls. And the time spent there tends to increase over time, but it's not very big differences, neither for girls or for boys. There's somewhat a stability in this, how much time they spend there, especially for girls between time 2 and time 3. But otherwise it's quite moderate correlations. And if we instead look at unstructured activities, we can see that it's not that big of a difference between boys and girls here either. We have a larger decline in time spent in unstructured activities from time 2 to time 3 among girls than we have among boys. And also here we can see that the stability is quite moderate. So if we look at the correlations between crime involvement and propensity and exposure at time 2, we can see that both propensity and exposure are significantly correlated with crime involvement, both for boys and for girls. And the effect of propensity is obviously stronger than the effect of exposure. And if we look at time 3, the patterns are similar, with the exception of that time spent in the city center at night is not correlated with crime involvement among boys, but is still for girls. And at our last data collection, we can see that we have similar patterns, but the especially correlation between propensity and crime involvement among girls have weakened here. It's not as strong as it has been in previous waves. And this might be due to, I guess, that crime involvement decreases much over time, but propensity continue to increase. So my initial question was that does gender matter? Yeah, to some part it's both yes and no in this question. We have higher crime involvement among boys, as we usually see. We also have higher levels of propensity among boys, but we didn't find any gender differences in relation to exposure. However, what we did see was the developmental patterns are quite similar, even though the levels differ quite a lot between boys and girls. Development seemed to be more or less the same for both groups. So, finally, one of the most interesting findings from this overview is that the different developmental patterns for crime involvement and propensity. And this is not something that you see, it's not a common finding always, so I think this is something we need to look into, maybe especially in Sweden, but also in comparative studies, so we can see what happens in Sweden that doesn't happen in other countries, that brings along a decrease in morality at the same time as an increase in morality at the same as a decrease in crime involvement. And I will also, as a next step of this, do a comparative study between minds and PADS and looking at gender differences in these features, in crime involvement, propensity, and exposure. So, with this brief overview of the project as a whole, I will leave the floor to my colleagues, who will do more specialized studies and findings. And I think the next. Do anyone have any questions for this first? No. So, our next speaker here today is Alexander Engström, who is a PhD student at the Department of Criminology, Malmö University. Welcome.
Yeah. Are you hearing me loud and clear? Yeah. Okay. The study. Wait, I should go back. What happened here? Did I touch all the buttons? Here. So the study that I will present here, it should be viewed as a starting point for my upcoming work. The results and the conclusions are somewhat preliminary, as you will see. But let's dig into this directly. My study departs from the basic fact that crime varies according to space and time, and that proximal features in the environment create situations that enable offending, and thus exposure to these situations may therefore increase the risk for offending, but also victimization. Previous research has generally been centered on offending in relation to situational criminogenic exposure, but less attention has been directed at situational criminogenic features in relation to victimization. But I will look at both offending and victimization, I should say that. And some specific features have been found to affect offending and victimization. So these features may be labeled criminogenic exposure. And these, the 5 that I take up here, they're not exhaustive, but they're the ones that I've been looking further into. And these include if you're spending much time unsupervised by adults, if you're involved in unstructured activities, spending time with peers, being located in areas with low collective efficacy, and also alcohol consumption. And I believe that a focus on situational criminogenic exposure may be useful for prevention initiatives because the situational perspective focuses on where the actual actions take place, and this could be the starting point from where we can find out what we need to look further into for our prevention efforts. So the aim of my study is to examine the associations between exposure to 5 situational criminogenic features and offending and victimization. I would also like to examine criminogenic exposure at different ages during adolescence to see if there are any differences during the adolescent years. And the data that I used, they were taken from the second, third, and fourth wave of data collection, and I used data from the space-time budget, which I will explain a bit further soon, and this included a total number of 320 participants who participated in all these 3 waves and also completed the space-time budget interview. And the variables that I wanted to look further into, they were then offending and victimization, and I looked at prevalence, so it's a dichotomous variable, yes or no, and I looked at the generic crime measure of, I used both property crime and violent crime against another person. So this excludes, for instance, shoplifting, which is a very common crime among adolescents. And these correspond to each other, so the same, so offending and victimization, the items measuring these are comparable. And then I looked into my exposure variables, my independent variables, which are indicators of criminogenic exposure, or should be at least. And I took this from the space-time budget. And these include the 5 previously mentioned criminogenic exposure variables, including hours spent, so the measurement is hours, hours spent unsupervised, for instance, without any adult supervision, time spent involved in unstructured activities, such as hanging around, no activity with a specific content, and also time spent in presence of peers, and time spent in neighborhoods with low collective efficacy. And the low collective efficacy measure was also taken from the community survey, which was conducted in 2012 in Malmö. And I also included drinking alcohol as an exposure variable. So this is a very, very simplified space-time budget interview guide. These are the, when we use it in Minds, it contains many more columns, different questions, but these are the 4 that I used in my study. So what you see, the first one here is the geographic location. You can see, I should also say that it's based on an hourly basis. So we ask questions about these things during an entire day, or 4 entire days actually, of which 2 days are weekend days, so to say, and 2 days are weekdays. And you get this data for each hour. So you have 96 hours for each sweep for each participant. But anyway, so what we can see here is that geographic location shows us where exactly the individuals were during that specific hour, which can answer the question if they were in an area with a low collective efficacy. We see that we can ask what they were doing, so we can find out if they were involved in unstructured activity. We can also see with whom they spent their time, which, for instance, can answer the question of if they were spending time with their peers, or in the absence of, let's say, parents or other persons who may supervise them or monitor them. And then we can also ask about some extra incidents, for instance, drinking alcohol, which I used. So what I did was that this data is on an hourly basis, so I aggregated the number of hours into an overall measure for each individual. But then I also categorized the data into 3 groups. So the adolescents with the fewest hours spent unsupervised, the third of the sample that spent least amount of times unsupervised, were defined as a low group, which I used as a reference group, to which I compared the other groups, which were labeled medium and high exposure. So those in the medium exposure group were the third of the sample that spent a medium amount of time exposed to a certain variable, or a certain criminogenic feature, and the last third was the high exposure group, which spent a lot of times exposed to these variables. The only exception was alcohol use, which was only dichotomized, because at the earlier ages, alcohol use was not very common, so it didn't make any sense to use that in 3 categories, so that was only a matter of if they spent any hour drinking alcohol, yes or no. So these are the descriptives. I'm not going to go into much detail here. As you can see, the prevalence of offending had a peak at age 16 to 17, which is in line with what Anna-Karin just showed us. And victimization has develops quite differently. It's a bit higher, but it declines over time. I think that the most noteworthy difference is in exposure, the 5 variables at the bottom here. The most noteworthy differences in exposure over the years was the increasing amount of time spent unsupervised, which also seems logical, given the expected differences when adolescents proceed into early adulthood. And similarly, the prevalence of alcohol use became much more common, which can also be explained by the same reasons, that they grow older and alcohol use becomes more normative, so to say. And my analytic approach was to conduct logistic regression analysis to see if these exposure variables could predict the prevalence of offending and victimization. So the logistic regression analysis include all independent variables in one model for each dependent variable. So what we see, basically is just how well these predict victimization and offending. So at this slide, we see that at age 15 to 16, offending was significantly associated with spending much time unsupervised and also reporting any hours spent drinking alcohol. While victimization was associated with spending a medium amount of time in structured activities, which was a bit surprising. And no other exposure variables were significantly associated with the prevalence of offending or victimization. So if we move on to the next age, we can see that at age 16 to 17, the amount of time spent in unstructured activities, a high amount of time spent in unstructured activities could predict offending, while the presence of peers suddenly became really important, which is interesting given the fact that it's at this age that crime also peaks among the sample. And the presence of peers could predict both offending and victimization at this particular age. And at the last age, at age 18 to 19, we can see that a high amount of time spent in unstructured activities was associated with prevalence of offending and victimization. But you can also see that a medium amount of time in unstructured activities was associated with prevalence of victimization, which once again is a bit interesting, I believe. So just a brief summary. There were a lot of numbers, but in text you can see that a large amount of time spent unsupervised and alcohol use are related to offending at age 15 to 16, as well as a medium amount of time spent in unstructured activities at this age. But at the next age, it seems like peers, spending a lot of time with peers is more important, and also that a large amount of time spent in unstructured activities is related to offending. And at age 18 to 19, spending much time in unstructured activities is related to offending, while both spending a medium and a high amount of time in unstructured activities are related to victimization. So just to sum up. So what does this really tell us then? I believe that some conclusions and discussions can be related to the findings of this study. The variations between the ages, as you could see, that there were different variables that were significant at different ages to predict outcome. I believe that some of these are quite natural. For instance, spending much time unsupervised is clearly more criminogenic at age 15 to 16 or 15 to 16 than at age 18 to 19 because being unsupervised becomes a more normative part of going from, let's say, early adolescence into early adulthood. And also it's interesting with this finding that the peer influence seems to be greatest at age 16 to 17, which may be due to the fact that Swedish adolescents start their upper secondary school during these years, and new social relations are formed, and this is also, as I said earlier, when the crime peaked in the sample. And also the prevalence of alcohol consumption becomes more common, and its relation to offending and victimization diminishes over time. And this is not surprising, given the fact that alcohol consumption becomes more normative, and in Sweden it's illegal from the age of 18 to consume and drink alcohol at pubs, etc. But what I also want to say with this presentation is that the basic finding that some of these exposure features are also related to victimization, I think it's important to highlight because many adolescents are affected by victimization. As you could see, victimization was more common than offending in the sample. So it's a problem that we need to know more about, I believe. And also just the last bullet here is that alcohol use, I used it as an exposure variable. Some would argue that it's an outcome variable of criminogenic exposure. There are different views on this, but I believe that in any given situation where a person is intoxicated or drinking alcohol, this likely affects the person's behavior in any way. So I think it's fair to include it as an exposure variable. And finally, as I said in the beginning, these results are preliminary. I intend to work further with this, and I think that the space-time budget data that I use, it could be refined further. I could look further into subcategories to see if certain kinds of unstructured activities are more relevant than others, for instance. I also left out individual propensity, which likely affects exposure. For instance, some people end up in some situations where they're exposed because of their individual propensity or other individual characteristics. I also used a generic measure of crime. It could be interesting to look into an offense-specific exposure. And also, I think what I guess some of you have already been thinking about is the role of gender in relation to criminogenic exposure, which Anna-Karin talked a bit about before me. That's also something that could be useful to start, a useful thing to include in the final analysis. And finally, I would just like to say that my main future aim is to look further into victimization and not that much in offending, because what this study shows, I think, is that victimization deserves more attention and to be studied in its own right, because it affects so many people, and I think that more research could highlight important aspects also for that could focus on victimization instead of offending, or both offending and victimization. Well, that's it for me. Thank you. Yeah.
We're waiting for the...
Ah, okay.
Morning. Sorry, I'm a bit tired today. But first question, victimization, what kind of crimes?
It's property crimes and violent crimes against persons.
But is it mostly violent crimes?
I don't have those numbers I don't know them by heart.
The point was that in our space-time budget, most of the things you get in the space-time budget is violence. And that could be important when you look at the sort of offending victimization, because sometimes people, when they get in a fight, become a victim and offender. So
yeah,
it might be. So that was one question. The second question was exposure. In our data, it's highly skewed. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how it is in this. I was looking at, we have sort of a very little proportion who have very high exposure, and then most people. So I wonder, when you do the analysis, if it might be a good idea to look into that, because it might be. And my third question is, when you do the analysis, you say one age something pops up the next day. Couldn't that be because they are very close, these measures? I don't know if you looked into that, so it might be more chance that unstructured come up 1 year and unsupervised. I don't know, but I just wonder if you have looked into that.
I can start with the last question. So you mean if they were interrelated, the correlations between the exposure variables? Yeah, they weren't that much actually. There were some moderate correlations. Especially, I think the highest one was between alcohol use and being unsupervised, which is not surprising, but that was 0.3 or something like that. But I think that I used also, I think related to your second question, I used these are very rough categories, I would say. And I know that you could refine them more and make combinations of these. I tried to do that as well. And I actually did not find better predictions when I included unsupervised, unstructured, and time spent with peers. But I think that, as I said, this should be viewed more as a starting point. And I'm really happy to include a bit more refined analysis of the exposure, because now it becomes very general in a sense. So it's something that I will definitely work more with. And your first question was? Violent crime, yes, the distribution, and I don't know if I mentioned it, but I used the space-time budget as a measure of exposure, general exposure for the individuals, but then I used offending and victimization from the questionnaire. Yeah. I think I forgot to say that. And that's because the youth in our study, fortunately, they don't report that many crimes in the space-time budget, so I couldn't use the space-time budget crimes for this analysis, unfortunately. Or fortunately for the youth, of course.
Okay. Yeah, can you just one on your last point on alcohol use?
Yeah.
So I think it's actually perhaps a better argument to use it as something belonging to the individual, because it's the individual who is intoxicated. Mm-hmm. The difference could be that, let's say, the environment, if you're in an environment with a lot of intoxicated young people, then it might be an exposure or an environmental characteristic, but being drunk or high or whatever is.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. I agree with you, and I just included it just because I thought it would be interesting. I know that in some other studies they've used it as an exposure variable, but it's also I mean, this is not something that I've been looking into, but it's not impossible that some kind of exposure leads to one outcome that in turn becomes an exposure to another outcome. Let's say that you are exposed to these features, you get drunk, and suddenly that in turn leads to something else. But I haven't looked into that, but that seems really, really plausible, I believe.
Since I have the microphone. I'm assuming you're using the term situational to mean environmental. Am I correct in that? Because you don't have individual differences here, which is how situational action theory would look at situation, is that there's actually an individual interacting with the environment. I'm maybe a bit confused there. What I did was basically because I would say that data we have from the space-time budget, they reflect situations, but then I aggregated them into a general exposure measure. So it depends on how you label it, I guess. If you say that aggregating these situations into an overall measure kind of makes the situational perspective go away. No, I'm talking about the interaction between the person and the environment. So you don't have a person in
No, I don't.
Analysis.
That's what in this final slide, I mean, I need to include these variables because they're likely, I mean, that's what's interesting, and that's what makes SAT different from other theories of criminogenic exposure, I believe.
And that's one of the big advantages of the space-time budget, is to be able to put people into settings and then look at that interactions there. It's just because the term situational is often used to mean environment or immediate environment, and so I think it's quite useful to try to make sure it's very clear what you mean by saying I'm taking a situational perspective or a situational analysis.
I was just wondering, when you were saying there's not very many crimes in the STB, I know you don't have, it's a good thing that in Sweden there's not as many crimes as we have in Peterborough, which is, you should be proud of that. But how many crimes do you have in the STB? Do you know off that?
I mean, I looked into it, but there were very, very few.
I actually think first, time 2, time 1, I think there are almost like none.
Yeah.
1 or 2, and then there are maybe some more at time 2, and then crimes again. So it's
Because I think if you're taking a situational perspective, as Kyle says, and you're putting the major benefit of the STB method, beyond how you've been using it here as a very detailed measure of time use and exposure, which is one of the uses of the time budget. Probably the best use of the time budget is where you can put people in situations, taking a true situational perspective. And it strikes me that even if you don't have that many crimes, it could be that the settings that those crimes take place in by the people that they are doing those crimes in those settings, it could still give you some very interesting results, even if there's not very many of them. And because of the way that you can analyze the space-time budget, you don't need a lot to reach significance as such. It's not like with regression analyses where you need a certain number to be able, it doesn't work like that. So actually, I think it could be really interesting to look at your exposure, particularly in combination, the exposure that you're looking at by individuals, even if there's not very many crimes, it could still be a fruitful way to look forward.
And I also think it might be maybe better to look at victimization, because we obviously have high rates of victimization than we have in crime involvement. So it might be useful to look at which adolescents in what situations.
Yeah, victimizations per 1,000 hours, for example, would be an interesting one.
Might be a way to go as well. So definitely will.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so our next presenter is Eva-Lotta Nilsson, she is also a PhD student at the Department of Criminology, and I think I forgot to say that Alexander has been working on the MINDS project for several years, and Eva-Lotta has been working on the project for more or less from the beginning. So.
Okay, so good morning everyone. Today I will present results from a study in which we have examined parents' monitoring strategies in relation to criminogenic exposure among adolescents. And we have knowledge from previous research about the significance of young people's exposure to criminogenic settings in the explanation of delinquent activity. And mainly, these kinds of settings provide temptation, opportunities, and controls that make delinquent behavior rewarding and attractive, and therefore increase the risk of offending. This knowledge underscores the importance of an increased understanding of what determines why some adolescents spend more time in these kind of settings than others do. And the most significant persons to prohibit adolescents from being exposed to criminogenic settings would likely be their parents. And there are different ways in which parents prohibit their children from criminogenic exposure. And we examined two different monitoring relevant measures as determinants of criminogenic exposure in the present study. And there are also indications from previous research that variation in criminogenic exposure might be explained by a young person's moral values. And what we don't know much about is whether moral values influence the relationship between monitoring and criminogenic exposure. And furthermore, the understanding of how the development of these variables are associated over time is very limited. And we do not know much about whether change in monitoring is related to change in criminogenic exposure over the period of adolescence, or whether this relationship is affected by change in moral values. And therefore, in addition to more frequent, stable between-person comparisons, we also examined associations between changes in the variables over time. So to sum up, the aim of the present study was to examine how parental monitoring is associated with adolescent exposure to criminogenic exposure. And first, we examined how differences in parental monitoring are associated with differences in exposure to criminogenic settings between adolescents. And second, we examined how change in parental monitoring is associated with change in adolescents' criminogenic exposure over time. And finally, we examined the influence of moral values in these associations. And to be able to study this and to analyze change, we conducted longitudinal multi-level analysis with data drawn from MINDS. And we used data from the second and the third wave of data collection when the adolescents attended last year of compulsory school and the first year of upper secondary school. And we only included the respondents who participated in both waves in the analysis of the present study. And this two-wave sample consists of 482 adolescents. And I used data both from the questionnaire and from the space-time budget interview to be able to capture different dimensions of both monitoring and criminogenic exposure. And we examined two dependent predictors measuring criminogenic exposure. And the first one is involvement with deviant peers, which is a measure from the questionnaire. This is a general deviant peer process construct and measures the amount of deviant and delinquent behavior as perceived by the respondent. And the respondents were, for example, asked if some of their closest friends at times skip school, get drunk, or vandalize things. And the other predictor measuring criminogenic exposure is time spent unsupervised with peers in unstructured activities. And this measure is from the space-time budget interview, and it measures the total number of hours awake during a 4-day period that the adolescents spend with one or more peers present, and in which they are involved in unstructured activity, and there are no significant adults present. One of the two independent variables we used as aspects of parental monitoring is parental knowledge. And this is an additive scale based on items describing the adolescent perceptions of their parents' knowledge about their whereabouts, activities, and peers. And this measure does not primarily stem from parents' monitoring behaviors, but rather from adolescents' disclosure to parents of their activities. However, this measure has shown to be a crucial part of the monitoring process and such is a marker for parental monitoring. And the other monitoring-related variable is time spent with parents, and this measure is from the space-time budget interview and measures the total numbers of hours awake spent in presence of parents over a 4-day period. And this measure, parents spending time with their children, represents a more direct and intense way to monitor children. And then we have moral values, and this is an additive scale from the questionnaire based on 16 items, describing how serious the adolescent think it is for someone their age to, for example, hit another person who makes a rude comment, get drunk with friends, or smash a street light. And in previous research, it has been argued that a young person's moral values indicate what a person considers as right and wrong, and that it might have implications for what kind of opportunities a person considers. As mentioned earlier, we conducted both between-person and within-person analysis. But first, we examined correlations between the variables, and we conducted t-tests to examine how the variables change over time. And the correlations between the variables were statistically significant and in the expected directions across both waves. And overall, the more parents monitor their children, the less exposed they are to criminogenic settings. And also, adolescents who perceive higher levels of monitoring seem to have stronger moral values. And also, those adolescents who have poor moral values are also more exposed to criminogenic settings. And the stability coefficients on the diagonal in the table indicate that the relative stability is pretty much moderate in all variables. And when we compared the mean scores of both waves, it showed that adolescents' perceptions of their parents' knowledge increased between the two waves, as well as involvement with different peers and the amount of time spent in unstructured socializing with peers without adult supervision. And the amount of time spent in presence of parents significantly decreased between the two waves, as well as moral values. And when it comes to the development of parents' monitoring strategies during adolescence, previous research is not really clear-cut when it comes to whether monitoring changes or whether it remains stable. In the present study, we did find that monitoring strategies change in the sense that parents tend to supervise their children less in the direct form, and that they seem to rather rely on other, more distal forms of monitoring. And the results also confirm that there is an overall increase in criminogenic exposure. When it comes to the longitudinal multi-level analysis, the results of the between-person associations pretty much validates results presented in previous studies that has shown that adolescents who receive more effective parenting are less likely exposed to criminogenic settings. For example, previous research has shown that adolescents with a high-quality relationship with their parents tend to seek out friends who their parents will approve of, and they are also less likely to acquire delinquent attitudes, for example. And also adolescents who perceive high levels of monitoring tend to spend less time in unstructured socializing with peers. And our results show that higher levels of perceived parental knowledge and more time spent with parents are associated with adolescents being less exposed to both measures of criminogenic exposure. And when we included moral values in the analysis, the results indicate that as far as between persons, lower levels of moral values increases the risk for criminogenic exposure. And when it comes to the within-person analysis, the results are not quite as distinct. Only parental knowledge of the two monitoring measures showed to be statistically significant in predicting involvement with deviant peers. The within-person estimate indicate that a decrease in parental knowledge can explain an increase in involvement with deviant peers between the two waves. And when it comes to predicting change in the amount of time adolescents spend unsupervised with peers in unstructured activities, only change in time spent with parents were significant. And a decrease in time spent with parents was associated with an increase in time spent unsupervised with peers in unstructured activities. And change in moral values was not significant in predicting change in neither of the two measures of criminogenic exposure. And the overall results, as I mentioned before, indicate that there is change in all variables in the study between the two waves. And when it comes to the development of monitoring strategies, it is rather difficult to say whether there is a decrease or an increase, since one of the monitoring-related variables decrease and the other one increase. However, what this does say is that there is a change in the ways that parents monitor their children during this period. And it seems like parents monitor their children less in the direct way, like spending time with them, and more in other, more distal forms of monitoring. And the results also show that there is an increase in criminogenic exposure between the two waves. And monitoring overall seems to be significant in the understanding of differences between individuals in how they spend, how time is spent, regardless of adolescents' moral values. And changes in monitoring also seems to be important to a certain extent when it comes to explaining changes in exposure to criminogenic settings. And the effects are, however, rather small, and also the associations are in relation to both measures. But it seems to be, there is something about the source of information, the measurement tool, that seems to play a role, because the space-time budget works good with the space-time budget, and the questionnaire works well with the questionnaire. I'm not quite sure what that means, but yeah. And these results, however, indicate that it is important for parents to maintain high levels of monitoring of their children in the transitional period of adolescence to keep them away from criminogenic exposure. Thank you.
Questions for Eva-Lotta?
Beth?
Beth? Okay.
Thank you. I'm also working on parental monitoring, as you know, and it was experiencing some of the issues that I'm sure you've come across. And one of the issues I spent a lot of time thinking about is that at this age, one of the as we know from our findings, one of the biggest elements of criminogenic exposure at this age group is being unsupervised, or not with your parents or indeed anyone else. And also at the same time, one of the biggest things that parents can do is have knowledge of where their children are, but also be with them. And when we're looking at what the effects of parental monitoring are on exposure, it does concern me a little bit that there is a tautology in using time spent with parents to predict a measure of exposure that includes unsupervised time. Now, it's not perfect overlap because just because the parents aren't there doesn't mean that they're not supervised. They could be with other supervisors.
Yeah.
And the time spent with parents doesn't necessarily predict that the activities are unstructured or that they're with delinquent peers or they're in various other elements of criminogenic exposure. But I'm wondering what you can do about that slight worrying tautology in your analysis.
I'm not sure. I've thought about this a lot too, because it is something with measures and, as you say, time spent with parents in comparison to time spent with peers, unsupervised, etc. And also, as you say, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you're not with your parents, you're unsupervised, and vice versa. But do you have an idea what I can do, or maybe just have a discussion about it, or?
For example, I think the model you showed at the bottom, where the only element that was significant was time spent with parents. Yeah, and it kind of makes me think maybe if your measure of exposure somehow didn't include supervision, or that's one way to try it. But also, what would happen to the other variables, the morality and or moral rules and parental knowledge, if you didn't have that time spent with parents variable in there? Because it could be that tautological association is knocking out some of the other relationships that may well be there, and may make you think that then there's not an association when there may well be.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I don't have an answer.
No, I don't know either. But
it's something
I
to be really careful of, I think, in your analyses and be aware of.
Indeed. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Can you switch to the last slide, please? For 2 days now, I've heard the expression to maintain a high. Thank you. To maintain high level of monitoring. Can you explain that? Can you make any example?
Okay, so as I told you in the presentation, it seems to be a change in how parents monitor their children, but it means that parents, even though they spend less time with them and supervise them in the direct form to the less extent, they should still try to know where their children are. They should talk to them and still have information about their whereabouts. But this is also about perceived monitoring from the adolescents. So it's maybe the most important thing is that the adolescents feel that their parents know what they are doing, actually.
Yeah, because I think it's a fairly interesting discussion, because with the new iPhones and everything, you can monitor your child 24 hours, but then we have another very interesting discussion. So that's my point.
Yeah, that's also interesting to maybe for like 10 or 20 years ago, when you did not have cell phones in the same way that you do now, to maybe do some kind of comparison to how parents monitor their children then and how they're monitoring now, and how often they use the cell phone to do that. Yeah, that's an interesting comment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things about parental knowledge that's interesting in the literature is that the source of parental knowledge generally is actually children's disclosure to their parents, rather than parents actively finding out about what they're doing. So it means that actually possibly the effective part of why parental knowledge about activities is good is more about the young people being happy to disclose to their parents what they're doing. So if you were a parent who was being lazy and just monitoring your child using an iPhone, it might be that parental knowledge doesn't actually have the effect that you think you're hoping it has. And instead, actually, the good discussions between parents and children about activities and things, that's the thing that actually is what's making the difference. So in terms of maintaining high levels of monitoring, that doesn't necessarily mean just somehow, putting an electronic tag on them, essentially. Yeah, and I mean,
I'm also father of 3 teenagers, so I think this discussion is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it basically means that you should, as a parent, as parents, we should make an effort to know what our children are up to, but that doesn't necessarily mean just without any kind of warmth or interaction or understanding between the parent or child about what that means. Yeah. It could be the quality of it that matters.
Yeah, the thing about this parental knowledge measure is also that this is not a, as I mentioned, a direct form, no, a parenting active measure. It is more, as Beth said, a matter of disclosure, which is more of a indication of the parent-child relationship, basically.
No, because it's so easy to have this. I mean, in the academic world, it's so easy. You know, so you should connect, you should talk to them. But in real life, it's not so simple.
Yeah. Good comment. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so it's time for our last presenter today. Oh, sorry. It's time for our last presenter today here. It's Professor Svensson, also from the Department of Criminology at Malmö University.
Okay, the title of our paper is Morality and Crime, and it is a cross-national comparison of morality in Malmö and Peterborough. And before we move into our findings, I will just give you a short introduction to the relationship between morality and the importance of morality in criminology. Morality has an important role within criminology and can be regarded as a central cause of crime. And morality has often been defined in terms of moral values, and that means what is right or wrong to do, and or moral emotions such as anticipated shame and anticipated guilt. And in this study, we will focus on moral values. So, and I will also say that within criminology, within the theory of criminology, there is explicitly one theory that focuses more than others on morality, and that is the situational action theory. And most of this discussion is based on that theory. So, first, moral values have been assumed to play an important role in the explanation of offending. And a number of studies have reported a negative association between moral values and offending, and most studies used an overall measure of moral values measuring attitudes towards crime and other potential wrongdoings. So most studies, or we haven't found any study, what we have found, that have used subscales of moral values. So most of them used an overall scale, so to say. And we don't know many studies that have examined the relationship between moral values and offending in a cross-national comparative perspective. So, and to move on, how can we explain differences in moral values? And we know that the socialization process is important, and moral values can be seen as a consequence of the socialization, and it is empirically well established that socialization through the family and the school are important in the development of moral values. So, against this background, we will in this study examine whether moral values differ between young people in Malmö, Sweden, and Peterborough, England, and whether differences in moral values can be mirrored in differences in offending. And we have two hypotheses that we will answer, and that is, the first one is moral values is negatively related with offending in both Peterborough and Malmö, and we assume to find the same results in both cities. And the second hypothesis is that family bonds, parental monitoring, and school bonds are positively related with moral values in both cities. So, and the data that we will use are from the two waves, from 2 waves, age 15 and 16, from the Peterborough adolescent and the PAD study, and you know a lot about the PAD study now, so I will not go into detail into that study, and from this one, the MIND study. So we have 2 waves here, and some of the analysis will be, we will use the 2 waves and do some analysis where we look for differences between the waves, and for some of the analysis we collapse the data for the two waves into one data set. But I will say more about that later on. So, and the measures that we will focus on is self-reported offending, and that will be our dependent variable, and that is a measure of 8 items, and it is about how many times the respondent has committed various types of offenses last year. And we will report, or we will present data for 3 scales for offending, and that will be 1 frequency scale and 1 variety scale, and also 1 scale where we report number of offenses by offenders. So it's a lambda scale. And then we have moral values, and that is based on 12 items, and in the original scale of moral values there are 16 items, but we excluded 4 of them because they are not related to crime, so to say. It's more deviant behavior. So we excluded them, but in our first analysis we included them, but then we decided to take them away from the final analysis. And that is the respondent's evaluation of situational and potential wrongdoing, and a high value on that one mean high level of morality. And then we have family bonds, and that is a measure of 5 items, and that measure the emotional bond with parents, and high value on that one indicates strong bonds to parents. And then we have a measure on parental monitoring, which is based on 3 items, and it's a measure of the parental knowledge about children's whereabouts, and a high value indicates whether the parents have knowledge about what children are doing. And finally, we have 1 measure on school bonds, and that is a measure based on 5 items, and all of the scales are additive scales here. And it measures the emotional bond with school, and a high value on that one indicates strong bonds to school. And now to the findings. So this one, this table presents the mean scores for moral values between the 2 cities and between T1 and T2, and that is time 2 and time 3 in Mainz and in Peterborough. I am not sure. I'm not sure, because there are so many waves. So, but what we have here, it's independent and paired samples t-test. So you can see that we have the moral values for Peterborough. No, first I will say that a low value on this moral value scale indicates low morality. And what we can see that for moral values for T1, we can see that the mean scores for Malmö is 20.77, and for Peterborough it is 22.69. And we have the study differences to the right, and that means whether it is a significant difference between the 2 cities. So it is between cities and within city. So, and we can see that the morality scale is lower, so that children in Malmö seems to have lower morality than children in Peterborough for both times, for both time 1 and time 2. And we can also see for Malmö, we can see that the morality scale seems to decrease over time, but we cannot see any differences between the morality within Peterborough. So, the morality, as a starting point, morality seems to be lower in Malmö. So, and according to that, we can assume to find that the crime, that children in Malmö should commit more crimes according to the theory. And will that be the case? It's not so clear. So here we have the scales for frequency scale and variety scale and frequency among offenders. And we can go through the frequency scale first here. And we can see that, so a high level here indicates that they have committed a number of crimes. And in Peterborough, for time 1, we can see that the young people have committed 2.23 crimes, and in Malmö is 1.17. So, and they commit more crimes for the first year in Peterborough than in Malmö. And we can also see that for the variety scale, that they commit more number of crimes in Peterborough than in Malmö. There are significant differences between the cities. But for the second time, we cannot see any significant difference between the 2 cities. And a quite interesting finding here is the frequency among offenders. we can see that frequency among offenders, the young people in Peterborough seems to commit more crimes. Those who commit crimes commit more crimes than the young people in Malmö. So in general terms, they seems to commit, for example, for the second year we cannot see any differences, but when we look among those who commit crimes, they seems to commit more crimes in Peterborough. So, and after that, we thought about it, and we decided to go into details in the moral value scale, and we decided to combine or to do 3 different scales of moral values, and we identified 3 scales here. Those items that were related to minor potential wrongdoings, and that is a scale based on 6 items, and that could be, for example, how wrong do you think it is to steal a pencil from a classmate? How wrong do you think it is to ride a bike through a red light? And more serious potential wrongdoings. So this is moral values, and it's different dimensions of moral values. And it's based on 3 items, the second scale here, and it could be like break into or try to break into a building, use a weapon or force to get money or things from another young person. And we also have a scale related to drugs, and that could be how wrong do you think it is to get drunk with friends on a Friday evening or to smoke cannabis. So what kind of results will we find when we look at these different scales? From the beginning we found that morality in general seems to be lower in Malmö, and when we look at the different scales of moral values here, we can see that it's quite clear results. We can see for minor potential wrongdoing, we can see that the value for Malmö is significantly lower than for the young people in Peterborough for both of the times. So young people in Malmö seems to have lower moral value or morality reflecting the minor potential wrongdoings. But when we go to the serious potential wrongdoings and to the drug-related offenses, it seems to be the opposite. So in Sweden, they don't think it's a big problem to do the small things. But in Peterborough, reflecting the more serious things, there is the opposite result. So in Peterborough, they have lower morality reflecting the more serious items reflecting moral values. So, and what can we find when we look for, and the next one will be the relationship between crime. Will we find any differences between the different scales of moral values when we look for the correlation? And that here we have the bivariate correlation first, and that is Pearson R. And we can see that the correlation seems to be nearly the same between the 2 cities. We have, for the moral values, we have a correlation between moral values and offending, and here we have the frequency scale of offending. It's 48, and for Malmö, it's 46. And then we can see that the correlation seems to be slightly lower for the other scales, for the 3 other scales. So the strongest correlation seems to be for the full scale of moral values. So I will not say that one is the best one, but it seems to have a better prediction on offending than the other ones. And then we decided to estimate a number of multivariate regression models, and we decided to use negative binomial regressions. And the numbers you have here, we also have control for the socialization indicators, and they can be seen as causes of the causes in this model. And you have, first you have the coefficients for the moral values, and in that model we also include the 3 scales of socialization. And then we have for minor potential wrongdoing, and there we also, so it's 4 different multivariate regression models for each city. So, and all of them are significant, so all coefficients here are significant. But what we cannot do, we cannot compare the coefficients between each other here because they are unstandardized regression coefficients, so we cannot compare them. We cannot say that For Peterborough, for example, the coefficient that is -44, that coefficient is stronger than for the moral value because they are unstandardized. So, but the most important part here is that the correlation between the different scales and crime seems to be the same for the two cities, and they are related to crime in the both cities. And now, we want to see whether we will find any differences between the socialization indicators between the cities, and we do that. We find that family bonds, parental monitoring, and school bonds seems to be lower in Peterborough than in Malmö, significantly lower for all times, for both times, and for all of the indicators. So they seems to have lower bonds, they are not so monitored in Peterborough, and they also have weaker school bonds in Peterborough than in Malmö, and it is significant for both times. And now to regression models, and this one is an OLS regression models, and here we predict the different scales of moral values, and here we include the effect of the city with the two samples of Peterborough and Malmö, and one is Malmö. And what we find here is that the effect of city is still significant for moral values and minor potential wrongdoing, but it's not significant for serious potential wrongdoing and drug-related offenses. So the socialization predictors or indicators seems to explain the differences between the two cities in serious potential wrongdoing and drug-related offenses, but not for the more minor potential wrongdoings. And we think that is quite interesting results, but as I would say that, if I didn't say it before, this is very preliminary results, so we need to go into details and how we can, we can do some other analysis also to test why there are the differences and why we find those differences. But now, will we find the same theoretical models to explain the different moral scales for the young people in Peterborough and in Malmö? And the answer is yes. We find that. We find that the correlation or the effects of parental monitoring and school bonds seems to be significant for all scales in Peterborough and in Malmö. And there is no significant effects of family bonds in either of the two cities. And here we can also look at the explained variance, and that seems to be, the highest explained variance seems to be for the full scale of moral values. It's 38% of the moral values can be explained by the three indicators of socialization for Peterborough and 24 in Malmö. So the pattern is quite clear. And some summary of the findings. Young people in Malmö report significantly lower levels of morality, and this difference can to a large extent be explained by Swedish youth taking minor wrongdoing less serious than British youth. And young people in Peterborough seem to commit more crimes than young people in Malmö. And the association between moral values and offending seems to be similar across both cities, and parental monitoring and school bonds are related with moral values and the different scales of moral values in the same way in the both cities. And now to the conclusion of this study. So first, we get support for our two hypotheses. We found that moral values is significantly related with offending in the same way in both cities, and it seems to have a more, the overall moral value scale seems to be more important than the different subscales, and it's quite important. But it's also important to know how it can differ within a moral value scale, and we can only find that when we do these cross-national comparison studies. And as I say here, as the second point, it is important to examine differences in moral value scale, and this study shows the importance of using cross-national comparative studies, and we can find both differences and similarities, and the toughest part here is to explain the differences that we can find. And we also found some differences, and it can be quite tricky to explain the differences, I will say. And to the final point here, how can we explain differences in the subscales of moral values, for example, the minor potential wrongdoing? And it can be something about a cultural effect or context effect between differences between the two cities and the countries. And what we have thought about, we thought in the beginning of this paper, we thought about including a measure of moral context for the whole city or so, but it's quite difficult to find that, and we haven't decided yet how to do it. So, thank you.
Questions for Robert? In the back.
You probably mentioned it, but what factors do you weigh into your description of school bonding?
I think if, I don't have them in my, I think I have my paper here. I think it is the ordinary school bonds fact. If you like school and what you think about your teachers and that kinds of measures, it's just the common measure of school bonds. No, truancy is not included. It's nothing about deviance. It's, no.
I have 3 questions.
Oh, of course, of course.
No, first of all, when you compare, because it's obviously average of all people, yeah. And the distributions of as you already indicated, that distributions on crime and on morality could be very different in the cities, yeah. Because it's a bit strange to find that the morality is slightly better in Peterborough, but high. A clue to that is probably where you say that the frequency that the offenders in Peterborough are high frequency, and then you take the average frequency. To make a long story short, it might be a good idea to look a bit more into specific groups and how they compare between the cities. Yeah. I do all questions. And so the second one is on this socialization and social bonds. Instead of this is a question, instead of controlling for them, would it be better to do path model if it's causes and if you treat them as causes of causes, in a sense? Yeah, I think that was all. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that on the path model. We can try that. And in the beginning, we thought about doing fixed effects models, and we did that. But we thought for this presentation, we just decided to present something and to do it and collapse the 2 waves into one general wave and then to look for the difference. But we can do it in path models and also for fixed effects models and then look for within changes over time. That could also be quite interesting. Yeah. Here we have one also.
Is it me first? Okay. Thank you. It's more a comment than a question. I'm using the same scale, and I did pretty much the same analysis you did. And we do it with the data from the German study Chances and Risks in the Life course. And then I find pretty much the same result than you do for the older cohort, which is nice. And I think what other aspect I could bring to the table is because we have the younger cohort, we find really different results for the younger cohort. And we started giving them the questionnaires from age 11 till 14. And there you find differences between the age groups. And I think this is another important aspect, because then you have the older cohort, and it's the same ages as 14, or it's 15, 16, 17 in our study. And I think you used data from ages 15 on, didn't you?
15, 16. Yeah.
15, 16, and 16, 17.
Yeah, so we have the same age cohort than you do, and we find the same results. And the biggest difference, I think it is in minor moral infractions, or minor, how did you phrase it? Minor wrongdoings. Yeah. Then we find that in Germany that there's a big decrease and it's not that important, or that people don't think it's like pretty wrong to do it, so it's not the biggest part of explanation in crime involvement. Yeah. And for the younger cohort, you find the exact opposite. Then it's really important how they judge minor moral infractions. And so there's a big decrease between the age cohorts. And I think it's important to take the age differences into consideration, and so we can do this with our data. And I think this might help to explain the differences in the factors when you take the age differences into consideration. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, sorry.
Hello.
Hi, Robert.
Hello.
Do you have any data on contact with the police on the youth?
Yes.
Yep.
Could that have an impact on the morality issue?
It can have. We haven't tested that for this one.
I'm not sure that we have it in the comparative data set, but I guess it's possible too.
Because the age of criminal responsibility is much lower in England, of course. That could be, well, interesting to see if there's it.
Need to look for that.
Any more questions? Okay, then. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.